Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege for me to present to you the inaugural lecture of the Wolfhart Endowment. And I also welcome the opportunity of visiting this Lutheran School of Theology again, where I have been many times in the past before. In the dialogue between theologians and scientists, it is important to be aware of the fact that such dialogue does not move on the level of scientific or religious discourse, but rather on the level of philosophical reflection on both scientific terms and theories and religious doctrines. Usually, when scientists talk about the general meaning and significance of their equations and theories, they already move on some level of philosophical reflection. I say some level because such talk does not always exhibit the same degree of philosophically educated reflection. The philosophical sophistication may be rather poor. Still, the scientist, the authority of his or her scientific competence notwithstanding, argues on the level of philosophical reflection when talking about his work and the work of fellow scientists to the general public. In the dialogue between science and theology, the fact that both sides meet on a level of philosophical reflection is of particular importance, since such a discussion requires a rather high level of philosophical sophistication, because the traditional doctrine of God is related to many philosophical issues that imply some relation to the language of science. This is the case in the notions of causality, of law, and of contingency. These notions are indispensable in any discussion about God's action in the world of His creation. Similarly, the presence of the transcendent God in the world He created has to be considered in connection with the concepts of space and time. Otherwise, talk of God's omnipotence would be empty. And similarly, the clarification of the concept of divine eternity requires a discussion on how it is related to temporal events. The contingency of events and the relationship of the concept of contingency to that of natural law was in the focus of a debate in a German group of physicists, philosophers, and theologians in the 60s. My own article on contingency and natural law that was written for those discussions was first published in 1970 and appeared in English translation in 1993 in a book published under my name by Ted Peters under the title Towards a Theology of Nature. During those conversations in Germany, the issue of contingency was considered as fundamental in both disciplines, in natural science as well as in theology, though in different ways. In science, the concept of natural law presupposes initial conditions and marginal conditions for the application of a particular law in the description of natural processes, and these preconditions are contingent relative to the formula of law. Although these initial and marginal conditions may be explained by another law, this again presupposes contingent conditions for its application. This fact could be understood on the assumption that basically all events occur contingently, but with some degree of uniformity in their sequence, a uniformity that lends itself to a description by hypotheses of natural law. In Christian theology, the contingency of events characterizes the logical form of God's actions in history. Contrary to the Aristotelian origin of the notion of contingency, the theological concept of contingency corresponds to the freedom of God in his creative action in history. The contingency of events expresses the divine freedom in God's creative action. This concept of contingency requires, of course, more than the nomological contingency of initial and marginal conditions relative to a given formula of natural law. It indicates the contingent occurrence of actual events, be it in particular cases, and then we speak of local contingency, or in all events, and then the notion or the description by the label global contingency is proper. At the time of the first publication of my article, contingency of actual events seemed to be suggested primarily by the unpredictability of individual events in quantum physics, but could be doubted with regard to macrophysical processes as well as with regard to the regularities of quantum mechanics. In 1988, Robert Russell expressed doubts of this kind in a critical article published by Zygon. Since that time, however, the development of chaos theory seems to have shown that local contingency of actual events does indeed occur, even on the level of macrophysical processes. This supports, in my judgment, the assumption that basically all natural events happen contingently, notwithstanding the uniformities that ordinarily occur in their sequence and permit a description by formulas of natural law. In my judgment, the basic contingency of each and every event in the world of creation, including the occurrence of order and of uniform pattern in the sequence of events, is much more fundamental concerning the task of a theological interpretation of the natural world in terms of creation than the idea of purpose is. In connection with the discussion of an so-called entropic principle guiding the development of the universe from the beginning to the emergence of life and finally of intelligent life in human beings, the old idea of a teleological determination of physical processes has acquired new plausibilities in the eyes of many. Teleological, that means that the telos, the aim, the outcome, is of determinative influence in the process that leads to that end. The belief in a teleological orientation of the development of the universe, then, seems to lend itself more easily to the assumption of a divine purpose governing that development. But for two reasons, I hesitate to follow these suggestions. One of these reasons being scientific and one theological. The assumption of an intrinsically teleological direction of the development of the universe requires acceptance not only of the weak, so-called weak entropic principle, according to which the later emergence of life depends in fact upon the fine-tuning of the natural constants in the early phases of the universe, but it requires also the assumption of the strong entropic principle, claiming that the early condition of the universe renders the later emergence of life and of intelligence inevitable. This strong entropic principle does not seem to be empirically warranted. And it is in conflict with the role of contingencies in the history of the universe. On the theological side, it is certainly possible to speak of a purpose of God in creating the universe with reference to the creation of human beings and to their final redemption in the eschatological future. It is possible in theology to talk that way because God's act of creation relates to the universe as a whole process, including its later developments. Thus, the beginning and intermediate stages can be contemplated in the light of the outcome they lead towards. But still, the language of purpose easily suggests a false anthropomorphism in our language about God, since it suggests a position of the Creator in the beginning of the universe as if looking ahead to a distant future and selecting means for achieving some purpose. Such a picture ignores the eternal presence of God, to whom the future is not distant, and who, indeed, precisely in his capacity as a final future of everything, is the source of ever new contingent events. The language of a divine purpose realized in the development of the universe is legitimate only with regard to the fact that the divine act of creation relates to the universe as a whole, and therefore includes its final future as well as its beginnings. But how is the Creator to be understood as active in the particularities of his creation? This question is not yet answered by the assertion of the contingency of all events and of all more or less enduring forms of created existence. How can the Creator be understood with the Apostle Paul as dynamis, as force that is at work in his creation? Romans 1:20. And how is his divine power related to the natural forces that are effective in the movements of the creatures? As these movements are taking place in space and time, God's relationship to space and time has to be clarified in such a way that his powerful presence with his creatures and their movements in space and time becomes intelligible. In Isaac Newton's doctrine of space, absolute space was conceived as a medium of God's presence at the place of the finite existence of his creatures. Space as a medium of God's presence at the place of the finite existence of his creatures. God was understood as mind, who by his will is present and active in the material universe like our soul is present in all the parts of our body. The biblical basis of this conception was John 4:24, where it is said that God is spirit. One of the very few sentences in the Bible that say God is such and such. The most important other example for this also comes from the writings of John and is, of course, God is love. But here now we deal with his sentence, God is spirit. For many centuries, since the work of Origen in the 3rd century, this sentence, God is spirit, had been interpreted in the sense that God is mind, nous. And Newton presupposed that tradition. But in the Bible, spirit does not mean mind. The Greek word pneuma, as well as the corresponding Hebrew word ruach, rather mean wind, even storm or breath. Thus, in the biblical creation story, when it is said that in the beginning God's Spirit was moving over the primeval waters, the image is that of a storm agitating those waters. The Spirit is the source of all movement in the biblical perspective. It is also the source of life in the animals and in human beings. In Genesis 2:7 it is said that God breathes his Spirit into the nostrils of the figure of Adam that he had formed from clay. And in Ecclesiastes 12:7 we learn that in the moment of death, and I quote, the spirit returns to God who gave it. Thus, the spirit as divine wind or breath is very important in the biblical understanding of life and movement. But it seems a world apart from modern science and from its ways of accounting for the movements of bodies and especially for life. So I thought, when I happened to read an article by a renowned historian of scientific terminology, Max Jammer, an article on the concept of field. Jammer, who had published important books on the concepts of space, of mass, and of force, characterizes in this article the modern scientific concept of field as a further development of the ancient Stoic doctrine of pneuma. Jammer even called the Stoic pneuma the direct precursor of modern field theories. Now, the Stoic concept of pneuma was in many ways similar to the meaning of the biblical word pneuma, or in Hebrew, ruach. The basic intuition was in both cases that of air, more precisely of air in movement, full of force, which according to the Stoics is due to the tension the air contains. The important difference, of course, between the Stoic conception and the biblical conception is that in Stoic philosophy, the pneuma was a cosmic principle pervading the cosmos and keeping all its parts together by its tension, its tonus, while in the biblical conception, the divine pneuma was conceived as transcending the world of creatures, though working in it creatively. Otherwise, however, the biblical and the Stoic conceptions were similar. This similarity, together with the observation that the Stoic concept of pneuma was the direct precursor, as Yama put it, of the modern scientific field concept, suggested to me the conclusion that the meaning of the statement in John 4:24, that God is spirit, is considerably closer to the field concept of modern physics than to the Platonic idea of a divine mind or nous, which Origen identified with the biblical concept of God as pneuma. Because Origen abhorred the materialistic interpretation of pneuma by the Stoic philosophers. Origen made fun of the bodily nature of the Stoic pneuma by saying that bodies can be divided and put together again, which contradicts the basic requirements of any concept of God as first principle, because all division and composition is in need of a further cause doing the job of the dividing and composing. This argument secured the acceptance of Origen's identification of the divine spirit with nous for many centuries. Although, as I said, the word spirit in the biblical writings means quite a different thing. But precisely at this point, modern field theories offer the theologian a conceptual help, because the spreading of field effects is no longer considered to be dependent on a material medium like ether, but only requires space, or in the general theory of relativity, space-time. Thus, the biblical conception of God as pneuma can be defended against the suspicion, going back to Origen, of involving some bodily conception of God without identifying spirit with nous or mind. Against this, John Polkinghorne argued that this notion of a field's immateriality is not correct, as he says, since notions like energy and momentum function in the same way for the field as they do for particles of matter, unquote. Now, the concept of matter is not, like mass is, a strictly physical concept. The concept of matter is a philosophical concept. And there seem to be different opinions among contemporary physicists as to the impact of modern physics on the formerly materialistic character of physics. The German theoretical physicist Georg Süßmann, for instance, argued that there has been a change in that respect, precisely in connection with the development of modern field theories, so that modern physics should no longer be called materialistic. Albert Einstein himself distinguished the field of gravitation from matter in his essay on die Grundlage der allgemeinen Relativitätstheorie, the foundations of the theory of general relativity, 1913. My own point was that the fields of modern physics are not bodies, in the way the Stoic doctrine of pneuma considered pneuma a bodily reality, occasioning thereby Origen's objection to its application in the doctrine of God. Like the ideas of dynamism in modern philosophies of nature since Leibniz and Boskowitz, the introduction of field concepts into modern physics since Faraday involved the idea of a priority of the field with regard to bodily particles. Thus, Max Jammer said, for a consistent field theory, the concept of particle is extraneous. It seemed, Jammer continues, therefore very tempting to interpret mass points as singularities of the potentials of the field equations. Another objection against my application of the field concept in the interpretation of the biblical language about God as spirit has been that it does not use the word field with the precise meaning it has in physics. Well, that is certainly correct. I do not contend that the divine spirit is sending forth waves that can be counted and measured. But neither is the word field in application to God, who is spirit, just a vague analogy or a poetic expression. It rather has a clear conceptual meaning in its connection with the concepts of space and time. If that were not the case, the use of the field concept would indeed become vague. It is because of its connection with the concepts of space and time that a sufficiently precise theological use of the field concept is possible in connection with the theological doctrine of God, a use that is clearly distinct from its use in physics and yet related to it. The reason for that is that space is the minimal requirement for any notion of field, while it may dispense with the idea of force, like in general relativity, or at least in some interpretations of general relativity. Since in physics the notion of field is connected with that of energy, in addition to space, the dimension of time is needed, or space-time, in the case of general relativity. In theological use, talk of God the Spirit in terms of field also implies a connection with the concepts of space and time, though different from their use in physics. This affirmation, of course, needs some explanatory remarks, and thus I shall have to offer some considerations on space and time before returning to the field concept. The question of how the eternal God is related to space and time has a long history. The idea of God's omnipresence always required some such connection with the concept of space especially. Although in his eternity God transcends time, he is still present and becomes present in the temporal reality of his creatures. In the early 18th century, the function of space in God's omnipresence with his creatures became the object of a famous controversy between Leibniz and Samuel Clarke, who, on behalf of his friend Newton, defended Newton's occasional reference to space as sensorium Dei, against the suspicion of pantheistic implications of that expression, that space would be the sensorium Dei. And Clarke argued that, of course, God doesn't need sense organs in order to know about his creatures. But the sensorium is the means by which the subject is present at the place of the creatures. And this is the meaning of Newton's expression of space as sensorium Dei. Leibniz had used the argument of origin against the Stoics in his polemics against Newton. The argument that if space were an attribute of God, he had to be composed of parts and would be divisible into parts. Clarke's rejoinder was that geometrical space, that consists of parts, presupposes some undivided and infinite space, because every act of composition or division already presupposes space within which the dividing or composing takes place. This infinite and undivided space, in distinction from the infinity of geometrical space, is, according to Clarke, identical with the divine immensity. It is presupposed in all our conceiving of parts of space, and in any act of composition or division. Hence, that undivided infinite space is also prior to all measurement, which presupposes and applies standard units of space. But those standard units are already parts of space that can be conceived only by presupposing that undivided infinite space. All geometrical conceptions of space, then, because they operate with units of measurement, already presuppose the infinite whole of undivided space. According to Clarke, that infinite and undivided space is the divine immensity, the field of God's omnipotence, in distinction from the geometrical space where we have parts, composition, and division, and which is also the space of the physicist and of his measurements. If one would identify the space of geometrical measurement with the divine immensity, as Spinoza did, one would indeed end up with pantheism. But Clarke and Newton himself, as Clarke believed, clearly observed the distinction between God and the infinite and undivided space of his immensity on the one hand, and the geometrical space of the physicist's descriptions of the world of nature on the other. At the end of the 18th century, Immanuel Kant, in his Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, repeated the argument of Clarke that every conception of partial spaces or space units presupposes the intuition of one infinite and undivided space, within which we may conceive of circumscribed space units. The same with time. The perception of any section of time presupposes an awareness of time as an infinite whole, according to Kant. In the traditional philosophy of time, such simultaneous presence of the whole of time was called eternity, since Plotinus. Plotinus said that the perception of the present moment and of temporal continuity in proceeding to the next moment is possible only on the basis of some awareness of eternity, which is to say, of the simultaneous presence of the whole of life. Kant, in his later period, no longer paid attention to the theological implications of our awareness of space and time because he was afraid of pantheistic implications. But he kept insisting that in both cases, the case of space as well as of time, awareness of the infinite whole of space and time is presupposed in the perception of any part of time or space. If all measurement in space and time presupposes the undivided infinite space of God's immensity and the infinite whole of his eternity, then the definition of the concepts of space and time cannot be the exclusive prerogative of the physicist and of the mathematician. Their special competence is the measurement of space and time. But in exercising that competence, the scientists move within an intuitively present conception of space and time that is not constituted nor exhausted by their measurements. The question for the nature of space and time, therefore, transcends physics and geometry. This is the reason also why changes in the scientific description of space and time, like the space-time concept of general relativity, contribute less than one might think to the philosophical question for the nature of space and time. This has been emphasized persuasively by William Lane Craig in his recent book, Time and Eternity, Exploring God's Relationship to Time, Crossway Books, 2001. It just was published. The contribution of the physical theories and descriptions of space and time concerns the measurement of movements in space and time, which is important enough. But contrary to Spinoza and Einstein, the nature of space and time transcends any geometrical model of their description, because the infinite and undivided whole of space and time, or of space-time for that matter, precedes all measurement. The infinite space of God's immensity, however, and the infinite whole of simultaneous presence, that is God's eternity, are implicated and presupposed in our human conceptions and in our measurements of space and time. Thus, God's eternity is different from the time of his creatures, but constitutive of it. And his immensity is constitutive of the space of his creatures. This comes to expression in that the infinite whole of space and time precedes any conception of temporal and spatial sections or units, and therefore precedes all geometrical description. At this point now I return to the field concept and to the significance of its application to the doctrine of God as Spirit. I said before that space and time, or rather space-time, are the only basic requirements of the field concept in the general theory of relativity. Here the universe is described as a single field, while in principle the states of bodily matter or particles are considered as singularities of the cosmic field. If all geometrical descriptions of time and space, however, are dependent on the prior conception of space and time as an infinite and undivided whole, the immensity and eternity of God, then this infinite and undivided whole may also be described as infinite field, the field of God's Spirit, that constitutes and penetrates all finite fields that are investigated and described by physicists, even the space-time of general relativity. This relationship, then, makes intelligible how the divine Spirit works in his creation through the created reality of natural fields and forces. The interpretation of the concept of God as Spirit in terms of the field concept then functions as a key to obtain some understanding of God's fundamental relationship to the world of nature. Such a theological use of the field concept does not and need not rely upon any specific field theory the physicists have produced. Nevertheless, it is related to the field language of physics, since it claims to deal with the preconditions of any physical field that occurs in the spatial and temporal setting of the universe. John Polkinghorne, in his criticism of my theological use of field language, did not pay any attention to my argument concerning the connection of the field concept with the concepts of space and time. He may have regarded this as a philosophical question which is not important for the scientist. Otherwise, he would have seen that the field concept is used not in a vague way in my argument, but with some precise meaning, though different from the field theories of the physicists. When I refer to Faraday, it was more the metaphysical vision behind his scientific work, the priority of his field of force regarding bodily entities that I was concerned with. And of course, I'm aware that the field concept underwent a long development since Faraday and beyond Faraday. When I called upon Einstein's field concept, I was primarily interested in its reduction to space-time. But I did not adopt the idea that the nature of space and time is determined by measurement and expressed in the geometrical scheme of space-time. I rather suspect this position as related to Einstein's professed Spinozism. He explicitly, several times, identified himself as a Spinozist. And I think that theology has to insist on the transcendent reality of God, even with regard to his immensity and omnipresence. My theological considerations on the divine Spirit as field aim precisely at the distinction as well as interconnection between the reality of God and the world of nature concerning its constitution in time and space. The space and time of the creatures are composed of parts and divisible into parts, which God is not. And they are object of geometrical description and physical measurement, which God is neither. It seems that the transition from God's immensity and eternity to the space and time of the creatures occurs when finite events and entities are granted an existence of their own within the undivided space of God's omnipresence and in the presence of His eternity. The finite existence of creatures entails relationships that are described in schemes of measurable space and time. The space-time concept of general relativity is of philosophical significance here in expressing the dependence of the metrical structure of space and time on the presence of finite reality, of masses or clusters of energy. It is possible to conceive of this dependence reversely by reducing the occurrence of masses completely to the concept of space-time, which would mean, if it would be possible to finish this way of interpretation, it would mean the reduction of physics to geometry. But the relevance of these attempts seems to be limited by the irreducibility of events in quantum physics. This is related to the emphasis on contingency discussed earlier in my presentation. In his critique of my theological use of the field concept, John Polkinghorne denied that fields as such have any intrinsic relationship to contingency. Well, that depends on how the concept of field is formed. Polkinghorne's judgment is certainly correct with regard to classical field theories and physics, but he himself allows for an exception in the case of quantum fields. The field concept in general should make room for contingency if time is to be taken seriously as a source of novelty that characterizes each new event because of the irreversibility of time. Whether such an accommodation of the field concept in order to describe the openness of natural processes is possible in physics, along the lines, for instance, that Ilya Prigogine suggested, is not a question for the theologian to decide. But it is certainly appropriate with regard to the work of the divine Spirit, who is the creative origin of life in all its forms. Life is characterized by self-transcending openness in the case of the individual organism as well as in the case of the evolution of living forms. The ecstatic openness of life to its environment and to its future corresponds to the creative activity of the divine Spirit. And if the divine Spirit works as a dynamic field, then here we have a field concept that is connected with contingency regarding the efficacy of the field. It also produces the phenomena described by chaos theory and is related to the spontaneous generation of large-scale orderly structures and complex systems, as well as to the effects of wholes over parts that Polkinghorne and other Peacock call top-down causality. When we want to describe the emergence of these phenomena in the language of a Christian theology of creation, we have to speak of the activity of the creative Spirit of God in cooperation with the divine Logos. In the Bible, references to the divine pneuma occur in different ways. One way is the identification of the essence of God as pneuma, as it occurs in John 4:24. And we have talked about this to some length. More often, the pneuma is seen as the power through which God is active. Finally, the pneuma is mentioned as a gift of God in the hearts of believers, or as a hypostatic reality of its own, glorifying in our hearts the Son and the Father. Furthermore, God is not only pneuma, he is also a personal reality, or more precisely, he is a threefold personal reality. He is not one personal God, but one God in three persons. The divine Spirit exists in personal centers in the Father, the Son, and the hypostasis of the Holy Spirit. Perhaps we may say that the field of the divine Spirit has three singularities, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And it exists only in these three singularities, though radiating through all the world of nature, their creation. In all of his creation, God the Father is working through his Word and through his life-giving Spirit. Both can be related to the scientific description of the world of nature. The divine Logos as creative origin of the forms of creatures and of their order. The Spirit with regard to the dynamics of the natural processes. The recognition of the nature of Spirit as field in connection with the theological appraisal of space and time contributes, I think, significantly to elucidate this affirmation. Thank you.